Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music.
Welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time. And this is Episode 43, War, God, War. Fornebu is back. We haven't heard from you since the mimetic disaster episode when Dumbledore and Gandalf defeated Bloody Mary. That was Episode 28.
Yeah, that was fun. So much so, I'm back.
You may find it odd that war and God are being treated together here, if Christ comes to mind.
Not really. War and God are both complex phenomena in our minds. Multi-causal, multifaceted, multivariate, with chaotic effects.
And Jehovah has that aspect of a war god, fierce and demanding in the Old Testament, recognized by the English of our subject with the phrase, Jehovah's breath. If you recall, that was what the English believed sank the Spanish Armada. Odin was a war god, and before Odin, Alator and Mars were worshipped as war gods in the British Isles by the Celts and the Romans. The Angles brought Odin to England, and the Vikings brought Odin, Part 2, The Return. Odin was tricky and clever and spent men's lives gladly when it suited his purposes. He was not above deceit, but kept promises. He could move like a snake and understood the doings of the world, flying above it and testing the hearts of men. But war is too complex, too great a human enterprise to be subject to one god only. There was Tyr, who exemplified the interior of man, the place where courage dwells, without which no virtue could last. The inspiration for the greatest heroes among men, Beren and Boromir, Drake and Aragorn.
And Harry Potter.
And Thor, who was possibly the main god of the common man. But there was another war god, never a great god, one seldom mentioned, an avatar of war that comes to earth when men approach war blindly, with dry and joyless enthusiasm. He was called Hod, and Hod was blind. Hod struck without seeing, without knowing, without plan, without wisdom. He just attacked. Blindly he made war. Blindly he killed Balder, the god of reason, kindness, brotherly love, fair judgment, and light. Hod killed him. Hod then descended to earth in 1618, bringing horror in his wake, and turned his attention to England in 1625. The war with Spain, voted for by Parliament in 1624, seemed like a solution to many problems. True, foreign trade had been increasing greatly during the long peace. Customs revenue had doubled. And counting the growth in illegal trade, historians tentatively say that trade more than doubled during the peace. But there were problems and discontents. Piracy was one major problem.
I know, it's almost unbelievable. Barbary pirates, sometimes called corsairs, from Morocco, attacked Newfoundland fisheries, the shores of Ireland, and up the Channel, even to the Thames itself. Hundreds of ships were taken, and thousands of English were taken as slaves.
Meanwhile, Lord Admiral Howard, yes, the Howards again, was taking bribes from pirates to ignore pirates. Buckingham, who succeeded him, was just a clueless, albeit good-looking man, and didn't care about piracy when he became Lord Admiral. The Stuart kings did not provide protection or intervention on behalf of Englishmen at sea. The Republic and Cromwell will change this, with their more expansive view of government duties, the rights of citizenship, and realistically, their far more stable financial foundation.
European governments of the time all acted as if they were afraid of Cromwell.
And well, they should have been. I said in episode 40 that the god of war deserted England under the Stuarts. The way that the god of war loved Elizabeth is said by historians to be an important part of the success of her reign, notably her defeat of the Puritans in the 1590s. So if God abandons the Stuarts, surely it had a negative effect on them in the hearts of the English. We know that the English wanted war, and James stood in the way. The 1621 Parliament was unanimously for war, an astonishing fact we cannot overlook. James dissolved them because he was still hoping for a Spanish bride for Charles. I almost said Spanish bribe, which is probably also true. In 1624, Charles and Villiers were back from Spain, their madcap diplomatic mission an utter failure. The Spanish ambassador asked for Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, to be put to death. But the Duke, the king's favorite, was head of government, and Charles loved him too, but probably in a different way than James had done. And then Hod turned his attention to England. Led by a blind war god, 8,000 men were conscripted to fight in Europe. These were to be the kind of men the local JPs did not want in their villages and towns. The poor, the drunkards, the troublemakers, the dregs. Along with a few volunteers and many German mercenaries, they crossed into the Dutch lands to die fighting the Spanish at Breda, and then die from disease and hunger marching to the Palatinate. Soon there were only 3,000 left alive. Poor planning, no supplies, no sanitation. These are Hod's godly powers. And then Hod turned his attention to naval matters. The English attacked Cadiz again. This had always worked in the past. This time they sailed with bad water and spoiled food and weak powder and a very bad plan. That's the way Hod leads men to war. They suffered on the way to Cadiz, and many died there. There was even a story that the English army, hot and thirsty, chasing a Spanish army that was just a phantom really, a false report. Frustrated and falling from thirst, blind metaphorically with regard to the Spanish, became blind drunk for real when they discovered wine warehouses. Maybe 1,000 fell down drunk to the point of senselessness, and were abandoned by their comrades, to die, unable to resist the Spanish steel that pierced their sleeping bodies.
Well, they were literally dead drunk.
They realized their plan to take Cadiz had been unguided from the start. Their secondary plan to take the Spanish treasure fleet was pointless when they found their food and water bad. Setting out full of hope in October with 15,000 men, they returned in December, much defeated, enfeebled, and much diminished. Half the soldiers and sailors dead. The king should have, inquired into what went so wrong, into why they'd followed Hod instead of one of the other war gods. But possibly that would have told a story of war profiteering, purchasing useless supplies of spoiled food and water mixed with too little wine. It would have told a story of corruption and incompetence that might have led to Villiers, the king's closest advisor. So they did not inquire. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference between wars led by Hod and wars merely led by short-sighted, greedy courtiers. And doesn't the king have the ultimate responsibility for who leads his wars? The next year, they thought alliance with France was a clever idea. France could help them in Germany to take the Palatinate from Spain. France was reliably anti-Habsburg, another way to say anti-Spanish. That also includes the wider Habsburg world. Charles had married the sister of Louis XIII, Henrietta Maria, and so to fulfill their obligations to France, they sent 7 ships to help the French attack the Protestant Huguenot city of La Rochelle. This seemingly clever diplomacy was an example of stupidity smart people commit. The court was so out of touch with the country that they did not realize that in the minds of the country, the point of English intervention in the 30 Years' War was to save Protestantism. The Habsburgs had reconquered most of northern Germany. They returned land to the church, threatening all who had church land in England, but most of all threatening to bring back the night of Catholic rule and superstition. So let's begin this process of saving the world for Protestantism by attacking Protestants in western France. Make sense? But it didn't. Most of the sailors refused to serve when they learned where their ships were going. Refused. The 7 English ships had to be mainly crewed by Frenchmen. The court opened their eyes and said, "Oh, this was a bad idea. Everyone hates us. Let's change course and go to war with France instead and help the Protestants in France."
You are making the court sound frivolous now. Aren't you going too far?
Elements of Stuart rule really were frivolous. That was a major theme in episode 41 with Knight Rider. Also in episode 40, James makes his lover head of government. In 42, last episode, the cocaine project plunges the country into depression. Later in this episode, Charles and Laud impose intolerable religious reforms on the Scots and lose everything. And they really did switch from alliance with France to war with France in a matter of weeks due to political pressure. Anyway, Hod came forth again to supply the 7,000-man force they sent to La Rochelle, this time to help instead of attack the Protestant Huguenots in 1627. Hod led them to open sandy soil in front of the fortress of Saint-Martin-de-Ré. There was no cover. Unable to dig deep trenches, 4,000 of them died, and there was much bravery and heroism, and even Villiers came in person to courageously fight in the front, perhaps trying to prove he deserved Odin's favor. Odin gave the victory to the French, and Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, while trying to organize another attempt at relieving La Rochelle, was stabbed to death by an officer appalled at his bad leadership. And so finally Hod left the English to return to his masterwork in Germany. It was left to Sweden and Gustavus Adolphus to defeat the Catholics and save Protestantism in Germany. The Swedes were well prepared, organized, supplied, motivated, one could almost say, therefore, well motivated, innovative strategically and tactically. The Swedes' thoughtfully organized supply had a substantial engineering corps, used light mobile artillery to directly support their infantry on the battlefield, adopted linear formations to maximize firepower, used musketeers to support their cavalry who were trained to drive home cavalry charges with shock and weight, and initiated the first general staff. They limited plundering and raping. They actually kept prostitutes away. The officers dug entrenchments alongside the men. Odin would give them victories again and again. And a quick by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar, in Norse mythology, Odin decides who wins battles. He decides which side deserves it the most by virtue of their bravery and hardihood, and throws his spear over the winning side. See the end of episode 4 for the world's most famous story about this.
Well, it sounds like the Lord of Hosts and Odin gives victories to the best supplied, best trained, best led, best prepared, and motivated armies.
Here endeth the lesson, for thus it has always been. Though England made peace with France and Spain, the Swedish generals would later make excellent use of thousands of English and Scottish mercenaries paid for with French money. France became the primary financial support of the Protestants, despite being a Catholic country, because it was a way to fight the Habsburgs, who were the rulers of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. And many English, up to 20,000 at a time, fought successfully to help the Dutch in their renewed bout with the Spanish. From Germany and the United Provinces, many returned to England with wisdom and experience in the practice of war. And so England and Scotland as kingdoms were at peace with the Catholic powers, while the people sent thousands to fight on in the Protestant cause. Many in the political nation reported feeling deep shame for their country's pathetic show of war and the unwillingness of the king to try again. And here we set aside the gods of war, with the royal court deeply divided from the country, a country whose patriotism they did not share, a country they did not understand, and a country from which they were increasingly isolated. And so the court, as described by Christopher Hill, became more and more isolated from public opinion. This was very different from the time of Elizabeth. Instead of being obviously favored by God, they brought out artists and poets to reassure themselves that they had divine approval. Quote, all the masks allegorizing peace and concord, imposed by royal authority, and the apotheoses and descending goddesses betray a deep insecurity and longing for help from the outside. Unquote. Charles was bereft by the death of Buckingham after La Rochelle. In his grief, he turned to his wife, Henrietta Maria, and they fell in love, and she became his closest advisor. It's very sweet, but this is real life, not a movie. Love is not enough for a king, and her advice would be very bad over the coming years. Letters between Charles and Henrietta Maria would eventually be his downfall. Catholicism was tolerated at court. More than that, it was fashionable at a time when it was understood that a death struggle was underway across the North Sea, when hundreds of thousands would have had friends, family, and admired acquaintances heroically fighting and dying for the Protestant cause. The king may have taken his closest counsel with Henrietta Maria, but who ran the government? His chief minister was Bishop William Laud, soon to become Archbishop of Canterbury and head of the English Church under the king, as well as head of government. Is there an aspect of God for government administration? Charles preferred Laud's emphasis on ceremony. He rejected Puritan interiority, possibly because it was so individualistic and had radical implications. All good men are equal is an idea that does not appeal to kings. Laudian Anglicanism rejected the austere Calvinism of the Puritans in favor of ornament and beauty. I told you of the split in Protestantism between the Calvinists and Arminians in episode 41. Laud was on the Arminian side, which could see some of the flaws in Calvinism, that it would lead to blaming God for tragedy, that it would lead to atheism. Laud, in this respect, was correct, as I've said in many times. I have a minority view, as Reindeer 75 expressed it, that religion, by its own excesses, causes atheism. Some anthropologists share this view. More people would if they understood that the most perceptive minds of the time, Milton and Spencer, agreed. But generally it's taught that the Enlightenment gradually spread in the 18th century, and that caused atheism, a sort of triumph of reason over superstition. But who tells that story? Motivated atheists. So that's the self-congratulatory story they like to tell about themselves.
That sounds unnecessarily harsh. I mean, most people are atheists because they think that's right, not because they have a pathetic character flaw. What's the point of this criticism anyway? Are you in the mood today? In one of the previous episodes, you provided the Steelman case for new atheism, lowering the status of religious fanatics.
It's all delusion to me. These religious struggles, where one viewpoint merely leads the next generation into another viewpoint, it's not a scientific approach. The Arminians and Calvinists were in conflict over religion, free will versus predestination, just as if it was a debate Augustine was having within himself. Religion becomes politics. Politics is religion. The Arminians, Laudians, thought Puritan austerity was self-defeating. Now, this can be reduced to the problem of God as the author of evil. Milton, as I've mentioned 3 times or so, understood the problem with God as the author of evil needed to be tackled head-on. And Spencer, to quote Christopher Hill, Spencer was anxious to justify the ways of God to man. In the cave of despair, the belief that God was the author of evil would lead men to suicide or murder, unquote. Yeah, you can tell what I think the right answer is, but what matters is what Laud and Charles believed. Theirs is also a story of delusion. When you begin to believe emotionally evocative religious ceremony, a beautiful setting, stirring music is religiously valuable, you can have many motivations. One possibility is a sort of Jesuit one that certain practices leaves one open to the divine presence. Another possibility is you can have a superstitious belief in the efficacy of the ceremony, in mood and getting God to pay attention to you somehow and do what you want. A third is that magnificent practices encourage simple people to imagine the awe of God, and that helps them find faith. A part of this third belief is that human action, finding true faith in God, leads to salvation. This is a free will argument. Their numbers may not have been large, but they were powerful in the upper clergy and tended to promote each other's careers and soon had all the top posts.
If you missed the idea that beauty has its own power and that great music can reach people's deepest soul, then you are the one who is delusional.
That suggests a fourth belief outside the Augustinian argument that beauty and ceremony could increase the power of the church.
No, you're still not getting it. Great art is beyond calculations of power.
Okay, maybe I do get it, but I'm finding it hard to express. By the way, I'm limiting myself to trying to explain Laud. He tried to harness the power of beauty.
It could be just as true that beauty harnessed him, right 350 years ago? How can we know? I'm not completely convinced Laud was a strong proponent of free will. It could be he favored a weak case and believed that beauty, the solemnity of ceremony, a dignified institution, could help lead people to God.
Or maybe he just had the aesthetic preference. And maybe it was merely politically motivated. We can be certain of one thing, though. The Puritans accused Laud of popery at every turn. For his part, Laud tightened censorship against his opponents to the point where eventually nothing could be published in England without his approval. And this sounds very Catholic counter-Reformation-ish, but Laud was clearly never a Catholic. In fact, he turned down an offer from the Pope to make him a cardinal. But all his reforms tended in a Catholic direction, from supporting royal absolutism to separating the priest from the congregation during the Mass, to his emphasis on decoration. The most visible symbols of this to the English was the moving of the altar from the center of the church and railing it off, as was done in the Catholic Rite. At the time, people could see the religion becoming more and more Catholic in outward appearances. And this, during a period of strife between Protestants and Catholics on the continent, widely seen as a death struggle. You can see how opposition to Laud and his reforms would be bitter and intense. People did not know that the Pope offered to make Laud a Catholic cardinal, or that he refused the honor. But people would not have been surprised at all that the Pope had felt the offer worth making. A papal agent was received at court in 1637, the first time since the Reformation. And we're 100 years in now, but it feels like going backwards. So here we have a country anxious is the word for the time, for the fate of Protestantism, and a court seeming to be leaning Catholic, maybe preparing to return the country to the old church. As we've seen, all patriotism and economic interest was opposed to this, thanks to Thomas Cromwell. And England is the only country where the duty to oppose tyranny is the highest of duties. P.W. Thomas says of the division between court and country, quote, "There were two warring cultures, but it is more accurate to talk of a breakdown of the national culture, an erosion through the 1630s of a middle ground that men of moderation and goodwill once occupied," unquote. And yet it was the Scots Presbyterians who kicked off the Civil War. It was an outright religious conflict, but when the English sympathized with the Protestant Scots rather than the English crown, the government collapsed. The majority of English cities and towns refused to pay their taxes to the crown in the crisis. This broke the power of the royal government. Charles had to go to Parliament hat in hand to beg for money to defend himself against the Scots. How did the Scots get involved? Laud continued to increase the power of the bishops over the kirk, despite the kirk desire for a flat organizational structure of equality among ministers. Charles and Laud actually said they would take back church lands in Scotland, the great fear of the landowning classes in England and Scotland. Laud actually changed Scottish worship services, prayers, and hymns to follow the Catholic-appearing Church of England ceremonies. And when these ceremonies were publicly performed, a rebellion broke out that quickly swept the country. Some believe it was orchestrated by the nobility and gentry fearful of losing their land, but regardless, it had obvious, wide support in Scotland. In 1638, nearly all the ministers and much of the gentry and nobility of Scotland signed a document called the National Covenant, and a covenant army was raised. The men in skirts were a challenge Charles could not face without help from Parliament. He raised an army to confront the Scots, but unable to pay them, they became mutinous and did not resist the Scots as they moved into England and occupied Newcastle. In fact, many of the English army were known to break into churches and pull down the altar railings and decorations. So Charles turned to the peers, the high nobility, for support, but even they urged him to summon Parliament. That Parliament was a short-lived mess, and Charles arrested most of their leaders and dissolved Parliament in just a couple weeks. Charles signed a peace with the Scots, the Treaty of Berwick, conceding everything. I take it back. I take it all back. And promising £850 per day. And the Scots would only leave once they'd been paid. The Covenanters in Scotland and the opposition in Parliament, we believe, were in cahoots to force Charles to call another parliament, and he caved. Finally, November of 1640, the Long Parliament would be called, and the old order would come crashing down. So religion got us to the crisis. The English would not fight for Charles. They would not fight for a Catholic conspiracy against Protestants. Charles appealed to Parliament, and that brings us to our cause number 2, the constitutional issues.
I feel you're cutting this short. You've left the impression that the Puritans, the other side, were just bigoted and narrow-minded.
I've been promising to go into the Puritan way of thinking. Okay, here goes, and this is going to be hard for modern people to understand. The Puritans had spent 50 years thinking and writing and preaching, and being living exemplars of the doctrine of the calling. William Haller has convincingly argued that Puritan preachers spent their long period of apolitical quiet building up a middle-class public that believed God spoke directly to their consciences. That's it. What people refer to as your conscience, that is the Word of God in your own mind. These people were in communion with God all the time, and when they met, they would examine their consciences, speak their consciences, try to come to a common understanding of what God was saying. In a way, they lived like Old Testament figures, like Samuel or Jonah. God was speaking to them. They often didn't want to listen. They often felt it hard to understand. And when there were disagreements, Cromwell, for example, would always call for a break and say, "Let's pray on this." And he really expected God would help inform them of the right thing to do. It's really hard for us to understand this, but imagine the process. You'd have to sift out your conscience from all your other motivations, all your other urges and thoughts, and try to subordinate yourself to what you would identify as your conscience. This would be a near impossible struggle, a lifelong struggle for anyone who approaches it seriously. This is difficult, but someone who has done it successfully has a presence to others, has a weird kind of meta-integrity that can't be faked. It's what Milton meant when he said that Cromwell was always victorious, because first he had won the victory over himself. Bacon said that the Puritans were the majority. We don't know if that's true. We can be sure that only a small minority would really take the interior struggle with conscience fully seriously. But these people would be truly independent people, their own masters, full of self-confidence. Monkeys react to that. They want to follow confident leaders. So I've always been fascinated by the Puritans. I see a direct line from that independence of mind to science, and so do many other historians, to Quakers, to Congregationalists, to everything that has created the modern universal culture, and before that, to the miracle. The self-confidence was a double-edged sword, however. Puritans knew what an ideal Puritan was like, and they probably knew some. Strong men and women who functioned in the world seemingly without fear, and while not without doubts, a solid, reliable way to resolve doubts by testing. But let's say you are not an ideal Puritan, but you would like to appear to be one to others. Then snap judgments, narrow-minded bigotry could be the best simulation you can come up with. And I think that there was probably a lot of this.
Enough so that it became the caricature of a Puritan, so that the narrow-minded Puritan would be a literary trope.
Valkyrie asked me how biblical literasts could be individualists back in episode 40. I invoked the doctrine of a calling, which does not allow any human to interfere to explain their individualism. But it is also here with the voice of God directly in your mind. Truth is in the inward parts. Therefore, you may reject all externals. That's what I mean when I say Puritan interiority. Sacred buildings, a mediating priesthood, higher authorities, they are useless. This individualism was not an accidental product. Preachers were deliberately organizing middle-class families against the concept of hierarchy. They saw hierarchy as an import into Christianity from Roman or feudal agrarian society. It had nothing to do with them. For the middle-class Puritan, God, who was accessible to them, remember, he's right there, just listen, was a far better Lord than any peer of the realm. We don't need them either. And as the Civil War drags on, these people will be the parliamentary reserve. They will rise up and find that they are strong, invincible. but also not terribly interested in wielding power, not permanently. They had more interesting things going on. If this is indeed a fact, it is underappreciated. A person with God in their mind in the true Puritan sense would be the best kind of human being, but a person only pretending might be among the worst. Okay, we've gone long. Let's take on constitutional issues next week after conversations with Cami. And thanks, Fornebu. Thank you for coming on the program. I really appreciate it. You brought some interesting thoughts on the effect of beauty to the program. Thank you for listening.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
All right, Cami, you've just heard episode 43. Fornebu is back. I thought he was awesome.
Fornebu is back.
You said it.
Hey.
That's awesome. Last time you said you couldn't say it, but you just said it perfect.
I'm making progress. What can I say? I guess I can't be taught.
We're never too old.
Watch the old cracks, okay? Because I've got my COVID color going here big time. So I have a couple questions about the use of the god names Odin and Hod.
Odin was a major god and was like the major god when Angles and Saxons were converted to Christianity. And then, of course, he came back with the Vikings to do the 3 Viking conquests of England.
Well, come on, Harold. These people at this time were no longer worshipping Odin and Hod and Tyr and Thor. So I don't quite understand why you've tied them in with all these wars.
Oh, just purely a literary device I'm using. Started at the beginning talking about war being too complicated a thing for just one God. I'm sure a Christian, Jew, or Muslim would disagree because the one God is, has all aspects. But pagans didn't see things that way. And so Odin was like a god of generals, and he was the one giving the victory. He was looking at the whole big picture thing. Tyr was on the inside, where a man could find courage. Hod's an interesting one that almost never appears anywhere except as sort of a deluded victim of Loki's schemes. Yeah, I wonder if anyone ever really worshipped Hod, or if he was just a character in the stories. When I was a kid and read those stories, I was always somehow sympathetic to him because he was, of course, blind and didn't know what he was doing. But the idea of a blind war god that leads men to destruction because they don't do their preparation, they don't provide the food, they don't provide sanitation, they don't think ahead, it struck me as a good metaphor to use for the Stuart experience of war, which was one vast incompetence after another, and led to simply one disaster after another.
Charles and Henrietta Marie. You talked about how he loved her and she became a advisor, but not a good one.
Well, it's so interesting because, they started off in this, sort of purely political marriage. Here we are, we're going to go to war with Spain, so we need a French ally, and so we marry off Charles to the sister of the King of France.
Great royal idea, wedding kind of thing.
Yeah, and they were different religions, and Charles had all kinds of problems with all the Catholics around. Henrietta Maria, he didn't like Catholic Mass, he didn't like all the confession going on, and so they were quite hostile to each other. And then, 3 years into Charles's reign, he's desperate, he's heartbroken, and he turns to her for help. And she embraces him, and they fall in love. And that's a really rare thing. But it was quite clear to everyone that they were a very loving couple after that time.
So tell me some of the ill-advised advice she provided. That was kind of what I was curious about.
That he did not have any obligations to keep promises, that he was a king by divine right, that God is going to intervene and make things work for him.
Did she advise him poorly into what wars to enter, or?
Well, the wars were over. They made peace until they screwed up with Scotland.
So we know that he took very close counsel with her because other people tell us this. But it's not like their discussions were transcribed. What happened after they talked and the kinds of decisions Charles made that were so disastrous.
Their correspondence was read by their enemies, like Cromwell, and it was very damning. Stuff like, I will make this agreement now and betray everyone when I'm strong enough again.
Though one of the ideas of trying to do a Catholicizing move into Scotland, one almost wonders if they were trying it out as a test case. Take back the church land, give power to the bishops, take away the Presbyterian prayers, take away the Presbyterian services.
If this works out, we'll
even
try
their
again.
Songs. Yeah, and then maybe if this works out, we can figure out how to do it somewhere else.
How to conquer the world.
And then build up their main army in Ireland and fill it with Catholics. And that, of course, just made everybody suspicious. And
I was just curious on their relationship. You don't go much into that here. Did they have?
You might notice, we did the whole Elizabethan era, and I never went into her character, never went into her, choices about whether to marry and not to marry. And I think that's right. I think the most important thing about her is that she was a monarch. And monarchs are very different from ordinary people and have a very different set of constraints and a very different set of goals. I couldn't avoid that aspect, that human interest aspect of Charles, but I deliberately decided not to go deep. Our focus is still the Industrial Revolution, even though I am doing quite a bit more detailed narrative history than before.
But sometimes I'm curious about the backstories of these smaller players that you touch on.
Oh, yeah. They're often fascinating.
So England is the only country where the duty to oppose tyranny is among the highest of duties.
John Foxe, Book of Martyrs. That's where people learn their history. That's where people learned about how the people defied Bloody Mary. How Dumbledore and Gandalf came among them to lead them to victory and drive out the Catholics, drive out the Spanish, which restored England to God's favor. A big focus of that book, I think I've mentioned this before, was the way that both of the sexes and all of the various classes, everyone came together to resist the tyranny. The common people exist only to be ruled.
I'm not touching that. Sorry. And we could go into that for a long time. So I really appreciated that you went kind of back and talked more about the Puritans with their teachings and their beliefs that God speaks directly to a person's conscience for the people to spend time and sit with and figure out and struggle with themselves a bit. That I thought was good information. And the summing up of how Puritans who were really working at that inward connection to God could be seen as among the best of people, where someone faking it could be seen as among the worst, I guess, kind of as somebody who's just pretending. So socially speaking, the Puritans, were they similar to, say, our Amish communities now, very closed, seen as different and keeping more to themselves?
No, they were very much out in the world, and the doctrine of the calling had a lot to do with this. So, like, if you were in your profession, you would need to be successful in your profession in order to pull off the status claim that you were one of the elect and were going to be saved by God. You would have to be, successful and make a lot of money and be seen helping others. The best way to do all that sort of thing is anonymous. And the best way to get praise from others is to have other people praise you instead of, you singing your own praises. So it encouraged quite a pro-social approach to life.
I've emphasized the social monkey signaling aspect from a kind of Robin Hanson perspective. A lot of historians focus on the interior psychological elements of these beliefs. They might be philosophically circular, but psychologically they'd be minutely inspecting their day for the godly quality of their behavior, sifting out the good and the bad.
And that was, a natural outcome of their doctrines, their belief in predestination and their belief that your status in the elect was visible in this world and that the elect naturally would be the doers, saved by their doing, but not for their doing. Predestined, so the fact that you're out there doing things in the community the way that you're supposed to isn't the reason that you're saved, but because you're saved, you're out there in the community making everything better.
Sounds like they were probably out there evangelizing quite a bit then as well.
Yes. Evangelizing, getting thrown in jail for it sometimes, being exiled to North America sometimes, but also quite numerous enough that, like I said, Francis Bacon thought they were in the majority. I'm not really sure that's true, but that's what he said.
Okay. I did appreciate hearing more about them. So wasn't it Fornebu that asked you to back up a little on that?
Yeah.
So thank you, Fornebu, whose name I can now say better.
Yes.
Been working on that for weeks, by the way.
So thanks for coming on the program, Cammie.
You're welcome. Thanks for letting me join you.
Quokka's made some really good changes at the website, hangingwithhistory.com. Go check them out. And go ahead and give her your feedback. I'm sure she'd be delighted to hear from you. Please click subscribe or follow on your podcast app. Thank you for listening. Just remember, you can always reach me at harold@hangingwithhistory.com. That's Harold is HARALD at hangingwithhistory.com or through the Contact Us link on the website.